I think it is a real concern that the Fed might not have all the tools that are needed in order to respond. The fundamental reason why it's a problem is that even before the financial crisis, it looks like the general level of interest rates in most developed economies, including the United States, had been drifting down. In a typical downturn, to address it, the Fed cuts interest rates 5 percentage points, 500 basis points. So now, if the short rate got back to 3% to a normal nominal level and a serious downturn hit, the scope to cut short rates to address it before hitting the so-called zero lower bound is only 300 basis points. And that just isn't what we have had or used historically to address downturns. So that's the fundamental problem. And the Fed is, I think, thinking hard and about to undertake a public review of strategies and tools to think about how they can address this problem, if at all. It is not a simple question. Fiscal policy was used in the aftermath of the crisis for a couple of years, and I think it did boost the economy in 2009 and 2010. But then fiscal policy turned restrictive, and instead of helping, it actually was another drag on the economy. Monetary policy had to work to offset. We have a high debt level now and large deficits. There is not a lot of fiscal space, but I think we should also be thinking about the role that fiscal policy could potentially play in future downturns. And I think monetary policy should not be the only game in town, but it's appropriate to think about ways to enhance the effectiveness of monetary policy. They would have asset purchases. They would have forward guidance, and my own view would be that they should use forward guidance far more aggressively and more quickly than we did after the crisis. We were experimenting. I think we learned a lot about how to give forward guidance. My own view is that the Fed's objective should be to bring long-term rates down very substantially as soon as they hit the zero lower bound. And the way to do that is to assure markets that short-term rates will stay low for a very long time, longer than would have been typical with the typical monetary policy response functions. And the Fed has to be careful not to lock itself into something that's inappropriate, but I think that would be appropriate. The Fed also needs to worry in a downturn that inflation expectations don't fall over time. If it's trying to achieve 2% inflation when the economy is performing well and not constrained, and then when the economy hits a downturn, policy goes to the zero lower bound, inflation may fall for a prolonged time under 2%. On average, inflation will be under 2%, and inflation expectations can fall over time. So I frankly think it's appropriate after a long period when inflation's run shy of 2% to allow inflation to run above 2%. I would be inclined to establish as a target something like 2% on average over the business cycle, and holding short-term rates for low for a very long time, coming out of a negative shock to the economy when policy is constrained by the zero lower bound. If rates are held very low for a long time, it tends to create a situation in which inflation would tend to overshoot, at least for a while on a temporary basis, 2%. So sometimes this is called price level targeting as opposed to inflation targeting. I'm not in favor of a formal price level target, but an approach along those lines I think could help. Other countries, Japan has used something called yield curve control. They seek to actually target through direct interventions the level of the 10-year government rate, and that's something that could be considered. I have qualms about doing that. Other countries have taken short rates into negative territory, and again, I'm not sure that that would be an effective approach, especially in the United States, but it's something that could be considered. Other countries have tried it, so there are some potentially other tools to consider too. The people who thought that quantitative easing, purchasing assets and paying for it by creating reserves or money, that would spur inflation, simply didn't have a good undergraduate economics class. The situation that the country was in after the financial crisis in economics textbooks, when I studied here at Yale, we used to call this a liquidity trap. After the financial crisis, the economy's ability to supply goods and services was way, way in excess of the demand for them. The Fed was trying to do everything it could to generate demand, and it lowered interest rates to zero, and still demand was insufficient. So quantitative easing was another way of essentially lowering interest rates some more. There wasn't scope to lower short rates anymore because they were effectively at zero. It was a way to try to lower long-term interest rates that were well above zero. But it was qualitatively just an attempt to lower interest rates some more to generate demand. And you would not expect to see inflation until demand got to the point where it was pressing against the economy's resources. Well, now the unemployment rate's down to 3.7%, and it's legitimate to ask, now we're at full employment. We're now at a point where demand and supply are equal or even more so. And now it's appropriate to say, isn't inflation in the works? But what the Fed created in buying those assets, the reserves it created, the world is different now because the Fed pays interest on those reserves. It's not money in the sense of an asset that pays no interest. To make sure that those reserves don't create undue inflation, the Fed is raising the interest it pays on those reserves, which is appropriate to control inflation.